By explaining the session, I want to acknowledge the College of Asia and Pacific and specifically the Research School of Asia and Pacific Studies because they actually helped fund some of our speakers and also provided funding so that we could try to bring some more developing country participants to this conference. This is part of a larger conference. Unfortunately, still, even though we had some funding, it was still difficult for a lot of people to get here. We had a whole stream on the Asia Pacific, but had many panels that got reduced down to only one or two. So if anyone has any ideas about how to get more funding for these types of things in the future, let me know. So the original reason behind it was that we wanted to acknowledge the fact that we were meeting the Asia Pacific and the College of Asia and Pacific was hosting this conference. And when Lorraine Elliott, who unfortunately cannot be here, she's had a family emergency, she's very sorry, she was really looking forward to this whole event. But when we were talking about it several months ago, we really wanted to have something a little bit different from the rest of the semi-plenaries and plenaries and panels. We didn't just want to have, presentation after presentation. It's the morning of the last day. You're probably all overwhelmed with information by now. So we wanted, in the Dutch term, I won't pronounce it correctly, it's gezellig, something a little bit more cozy, fireside chat type of thing where we just do Q&A. I'll start with a round of questions for everyone, and then you guys can just jump in and take over. And the general theme is Asia Pacific, but we have a really interesting array of different types of expertise, so we'll cover a lot of different issues. So I'll just introduce everybody first, and then I'll start with one round of questions, and then we'll kick it over to you. So first, Professor Sun Jin Yoon. She's a professor at the Graduate School of Environmental Studies at Seoul National University. And she received her PhD in Energy and Environmental Policy from the University of Delaware. She's an ex-president of a grassroots energy organization, the Center for Energy Alternatives, which introduced the Citizens Power Plant model and Passive House into Korea. Currently, she is the executive co-chairman of the Korea's Professors Organization for a Post-Nuclear Society. And her research concentrates on the political economy of climate change, climate and energy policies, environmental and climate justice, anti-nuclear and energy transition movements, discourse analysis, and common resource management. I don't know how to manage to cover all of that. Next we have Pishaman May Yeo Fanton, who's a lecturer, assistant professor in international relations and development at the School of Social Sciences, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, here in Australia. She completed her PhD in politics and international relations here at the ANU, and as an inaugural China Institute Scholar and Headley Bull Scholar. She's conducted extensive fieldwork in China and mainland Southeast Asia, and has been a consultant to the Africa Progress Panel and the Overseas Development Institute. Her research focuses on how responsibility features in China's engagement with global governance and the ecological footprint of Chinese resource investments in Southeast Asia. Next we have Professor Shumei Bai, who's professor of urban environment and human ecology at the Fenner School of Environment and Society here at the ANU. Previously, she's worked as a senior principal research scientist at CSIRO and a senior research fellow at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan, and also as a research scientist at the Japanese Center for International Studies in Ecology. And her research focuses on several frontiers in urban industrial ecology and urban sustainability science, including urban policy and governance, urban resilience in cities as a complex system, sustainability transition in Asia, and regional development and environmental policy in China. Now next we had, unfortunately, our advertised speaker, Dulciana Sommer-Brash, was very ill and could not travel. But as it happens, we lost one and we gained two. So I think we've done quite well. So we have a dynamic duo, a married couple, Dr. Joanna Nallow and Paul Nallow. So Joanna is a social scientist with a PhD in climate change adaptation from Griffith University. And she's conducted research in Australia, Vanuatu, Zanzibar, and her research focuses on understanding the usefulness of adaptation science for policy and practice in the Pacific, and in Melanesia in particular, and issues regarding traditional knowledge and community-based development and adaptation. She's also the contributing author for the IPCC's fifth assessment report, chapters 16 and 25, and one of her research interests is examining the concept of limits to adaptation and processes relating to adaptation governance. And Paul is the sector analyst for youth and education in the Office of the Prime Minister, Government of Vanuatu, where he's involved in developing the National Sustainable Development Plan and strengthening youth networks across the country. He's also a provincial planner for Tafia province, which is a province that was devastated by tropical cyclone Pam, and we're going to be discussing that today. So Paul's unique skills are his ability to work across multiple scales from the national down to the village level, and his in-depth understanding of local culture, beliefs, and integration of development agendas with local aspirations and priorities. And part of his volunteer work includes working with the chiefs on Tanna Island in developing climate-resilient solutions for housing and governments. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially for our last-minute additions for stepping up to the plate. We really appreciate it, and we're really happy to have you involved. All right, so I'll just start off with a few questions for each. So start on this end. So, recently a member of the Earth System Governance Network, which is what we're all here for in this conference, wrote an article in which Korea was described as a green middle power. And in particular, the country is noted for having engaged in significant diplomacy on green growth. So I'm curious, what do you make of Korea's role in pushing green growth as an agenda on the world stage? And why do you think President Lee Min-bak pursued that agenda? Has it been good for Korea? And has it now disappeared from Korean politics now that he's finished his term?
Yeah, actually, I think we need to consider, do we need to use the term green growth instead of sustainable development? Because it is not the same concept. So when the government, actually ex-government, Lee Min-bak government, suggested new frame, low carbon green growth. It was announced in 2008, our Independence Day. He gave a speech and suggested as a new development framework and called low carbon green growth. And you know, differently from sustainable development, there was no social discussion. Just he suggested. So people in South Korea were embarrassed. What happened? Why green growth instead of sustainable development? What's the difference? So, and you know, because of that term, he drew big attention from international society. And under the name of green growth, he initiated big nationwide, maybe one of the biggest national projects called Four Major River Restoration Project. But you know, people do not say that project as restoration project. Instead, people say Four Major River Killing Project. Because they said our rivers needs to be restored. It means it is dead now. But you know, actually, even though we have some kind of a pollution issue in some area, but not for all, but the four major river means all country. Because we have the biggest four major rivers supply our tap water, and it is used for agriculture and industrial activities and daily life. So we think river is very important. But he said, for green growth, we need to have green job, and the Four Major River Restoration Project is a kind of a new Green Deal. So it was initiated, but it was opposed a lot. For example, more than 2,500 professors made the organization to resist against that idea, and it was published by Science. And the journal, the magazine Science said, it is very interesting phenomena. The government initiated that project. Why these famous and very socially renowned professors resist against that project? And the project was initiated under the name of green growth. So, but you know, it means it lost legitimation in our domestic society. Instead, it drew justification from international society because UNEP picked up Korea as an example of green economy because they set up green economy initiative in 2008, I think, and they picked up Korea as the first example of green economy. But I think green economy is very different from green growth because green growth it already growth orientation already embedded. And even though they use green, it is a kind of greenwashing, a kind of modification of growth. So it doesn't, green growth just argue. We need to have some kind of harmony with between economic growth and environmental protection or development. So we can keep growing with some kind of environmentally friendly way. But the main indicator of green growth is efficiency. So efficiency means it does not consider about the sufficiency or substance economy, and it still pursued growth. And there was no social consensus and agreement. There was no room for civil society to be engaged in that discourse. So I think the starting point of green growth was totally awkward. And under the name of sustainable development, Korea was praised a lot by international society because Korea established a Presidential Commission on Sustainable Development since 2000, and its activity was quite good, and it coordinated governmental ministries and some conflicts in our society, but it was maybe the government kept that organization, but not Presidential Commission. It was maybe stepped back. It was a committee under Ministry of Environment. Instead, the government established Presidential Committee on Green Growth. And how many people from civil society invited in that Green Growth Committee, President Committee? Just one. And the one person is not the representative of civil society. It was very small local-based organization. It is not the nationwide and nationally renowned organization or supported organization. So my argument here is, I think the starting point of green growth is occurred, and it just employed to justify what the President Lee Myung-bak want to have. So still, it is not green growth, it is brown growth or gray growth. So, but as you introduced me, there is one. Actually, myself was engaged in to resist against that Four Major River project, and at that time I criticized the UNEP a lot because UNEP just praised Korea, and there was no listening from the voice of civil society. They just followed the Korean government provided, the document Korean government provided. So that kind of approach justified very bad project in each country. So I thought it obligates maybe the mission of the UNEP. So this kind of approach, I think the other aspect I'm very worried about is because Korea can be exemplified for other developing countries with this awkward concept. So I think we need to be alert how bad this concept is and how much, how big opposition was happened in Korean society. That kind of aspect should be observed, and and I don't think Korea can be a role to pursue green growth because nowadays, as you mentioned, the current President Park Geun-hye administration do not use the term green growth anymore. During Lee Myung-bak administration, every minister used that term. Every document included green growth, green growth, green growth. But now, disappear. We cannot find anything because they want to avoid that kind of mistake or some kind of error made by previous government. And another project the Lee Myung-bak government pursued under the name of green growth was nuclear power expansion policy. And such a small country, we have 24 reactors in operation and 4 under construction and 8 are waiting for construction. So we will have 36 reactors in 2029. So currently, Korea ranks number 6 in terms of installation capacity of nuclear power plant, and Korea ranks number 1 in terms of density. Because such a small country has many numbers of nuclear reactors, and in terms of population around nuclear power plant, Korea ranks number 4. So it gives a big threat to our people's safe life, but still the government pursue, and the government says it is a way of green growth, because green means low carbon. Nuclear does not emit or emit very little CO2, so it is low carbon green energy. So we need to see what is the problem underlined under the concept of green growth.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So moving on to Pishman, we hear a lot, especially in Australia, on the topic of growth of Chinese foreign investment here and elsewhere in the Asia Pacific region. But not much about what you study, which is the impact of that investment on resource governance and the environment. Can you tell us a bit more about the countries and the types of investment you've studied and what might be different about Chinese investments versus investments from other countries?
The problem is, of course, the fact that China invests quite heavily in developing countries. And I mean, if it's the case in South Korea that President Lee Myung-bak almost unilaterally announced the concept of green growth, what you see in countries of Southeast Asia, what you see in Africa and Latin America, really is almost the absence of any appreciation that concepts like green growth or sustainable development really do matter. It sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it is the case that, let's say, in Cambodia or in Myanmar, the governments do have very robust legal frameworks in place to monitor and regulate foreign investment. They do have regulatory tools in order to monitor environmental degradation. The problem, however, is that they're not enforced. And when you add in, I mean, when you look at the authoritarian nature of these regimes, when you look at that lack of political will and the lack of capacity to enforce these regulations, and compound that with the availability of Chinese investment, what you have really is a mixture for long-term disaster. In many cases, Chinese investment has really targeted the resource sectors of these countries. They tend to be concentrated in hydropower, in the extractive sector, and also in the forestry sector. But hydropower in particular has proven a very strong area of Chinese investment. And this has resulted in a number of environmental and social problems within the countries in Southeast Asia, Africa, as well as Latin America. But so if I were to give you an example of one instance, and that would be the Shire Rain Dam in Cambodia. So this dam is or was going to be financed by one of China's biggest hydropower companies called Sino-Hydro. And the dam is actually quite small. It's only expected to produce, say, 100 megawatts of power. However, it's located in one of the most pristine and ecologically fragile forests in Cambodia, and that's the Yareng Valley. And this valley is also home to indigenous peoples. And you can, if you're familiar with the discourse and the debate surrounding hydropower development, you will know that with any dam construction, a number of social and environmental problems tend to accompany it. And this is no different for the Shire Rain case. So the dam itself, aside from being developed by a major Chinese SOE, state-owned enterprise, really had no environmental impact assessment in place. There was no engagement with local communities, so local communities really had no idea what was going on. I spoke with some, and they told me that there was at one point a Cambodian official who came with a representative from this hydropower company. They came around and asked local villagers whether or not they consented to the dam project. And of course, villagers had no idea what this dam project was. But they felt visibly pressured by these two individuals to give their thumbprints, because these are, of course, villagers who can't really read or write, to give their thumbprints as consent to their being to consent to this project and to their being relocated from the area. So it's really the case that Chinese investment has, even though it comes with the promise of economic development, as some governments would argue, has really come at a considerable price as well. In these countries where governance is already very weak, Chinese investment has really further undermined already very weak regulatory frameworks. And as I said, this is the case not just simply for Southeast Asia, but also for countries in the Pacific Islands, right? You have the case of the Ramu nickel project in Papua New Guinea, which is also expected to have severe environmental consequences on the surrounding biodiversity and environment. So in terms of resource government, Chinese investment has really not helped the cause of sustainable resource governance. But if anything, if we were to look at the silver lining, it is the case that as a result of these very controversial resource schemes, what you are now seeing are emerging pockets of resistance within Southeast Asia, within Africa, and also within Latin America and the Pacific. And these are grassroots resistance movements that are really helping to increase the sense of environmental consciousness, the belief that people have the ability and they have the right to protest against what they think is inherently unjust. And it has really helped the cause of environmental activism within these developing regions, which before, let's say, the advent of Chinese investment, or the increase in Chinese investment, which happened around the turn of the millennium, environmental consciousness in parts of Southeast Asia and so on weren't really as strong. So now we are seeing an increase in those trends, and if anything, this holds promise. If you are a believer, as I am, in the concept of civil regulation, this holds a lot of promise in terms of providing greater space for civil society actors to help in regulating through informal channels Chinese investment, but also investors from other countries.
And we will pick up on these issues after everyone's had a chance to talk, and everyone can ask questions from the audience. So switching gears again, Junai, the World Bank reported earlier this year that 200 million people moved into Asia's cities in the first decade of the 21st century. Despite this, Asia's urbanization boom may only be beginning. So what does this mean for the sustainability of the region, and what efforts are being made to make Asian cities greener and more livable?
Yeah, I guess I'm biased because I work on urban and urbanization, but my favorite quote is that sustainability battle will be won or lost in cities. So I think that actually really epitomizes the importance of looking at cities in terms of sustainability argument. And I think it's particularly important for Asia because Asia has the largest urban population, has the most majority of mega cities, and one of the most rapidly urbanizing region in the world, only next to some of the sub-Saharan African part. And also in Asia, it's particularly important because it's very often coupled with industrialization, and also the urbanization actually is fueled by economic growth. For example, we have done a study a couple of 2 years ago, looking at urban land expansion and income growth in the city as well as in the province that harbors the city. And we found a very strong sort of positive reinforcing sort of relationship going on, which means that expansion of urban land in that particular area actually grows the income in the city as well as in the province. And then, such growth actually coming back, fueling the expansion of urban land use. So you can see there's a very strong sort of driving force behind it. And I used to say urbanization is really one of the biggest transformation in human history that are happening right in front of our eyes. For example, like in China alone, every year we have like 14 million new population added to cities. And that's that's a huge amount of population. It's half of, more than half of Australian entire population that are adding to cities each and every year. And there's some research saying by 2050, more infrastructure has to be built than what is already existing in order to accommodate all the new urban population that will be added into cities. So I think looking at the urbanization is important, but also it is also very important to look at what this sort of urbanization actually means within the city scope itself. For example, such urbanization process is very often driven by the aspiration of rural residents for a better life, better job, and better education for their offsprings. So it's really driven by sort of a dream, and we call it the Chinese dream of China, whatever Chinese dream is actually an urban dream. So, but if you look at the reality, we have like 250 million floating population, or in a more popularly used sort of term, which is called peasant workers. And these people are coming from rural part of China and coming to the coastal cities, work there, but they don't really have appropriate social security network or health care, or in many cases their kids don't have proper access to education system in the cities, and then they are living in really shabby, almost like shantytown kind of places. So there are lots of social problems as well. And then if you look at environmental issues, I think many of you have heard of this Beijing smog, Beijing PM 2.5 skyrocketing, and there are if you look at the meter is only designed to measure until 999 PM, but it's just bursting that meter. It's going beyond 1,000, beyond 2,000 in extreme cases. So if it's 1,500, you only see 500 ppm, PM 2.5. But of course, people know it's 1,500. So there are very heavy sort of environmental prices that you're paying because of this rapid urbanization coupled with industrialization, and then coupled with the environmental regulation is not really keeping up with the pace of urbanization. And also looking at China as well as beyond China and looking into Asia, I think one of the issues that are very often ignored is that the existence of extreme poverty in Asian cities. And there's a common sort of belief within Asian countries, as well as in many donor sort of organizations, saying urbanization means usually people coming to cities, they can enjoy better life and higher income. And that is in part true. If you look at Chinese cities, the income disparity between urban residents and rural residents is 3.2, something like that. So an average urban resident earns 3 times more than a rural resident. So it's quite natural for people to think cities actually represent progress and prosperity and better life. But actually that really, really masks the extreme poverty that are existing within the urban small pockets. And you can find some of those in Chinese cities, but in other parts of Asian cities it's even more prominent. Like for example, Mumbai, half of the city population are living in the slum area. I think many of you have seen the movie of and in Philippines, for example. So there are this very strong sort of poverty revealed there, but the donor institutions usually think, urban is a better off place, so probably we should really invest in urban poverty. And what we should be doing is actually invest in rural areas so that people don't actually come to cities. But then what about people that are already living in the poverty situation within cities? So I think there is a sort of, neglected pocket in terms of policy and in terms of the social issues in there. So what has been done so far to really address these issues? There has lots of, been lots of things been done, both at national level as well as city level. For example, China has introduced this national new type urbanization plan sometime last year, and then it has all the good things within in the target. Say by 2020, the country will have 60% of population living in cities, and then a certain amount of I think it's like 90% having proper infrastructure and all those sort of targets. And one of them I particularly remember say 50% of all new buildings that will be built will be green buildings. So, and then if you go back and check what was the ratio of green building in 2012, for example, right before it was released, it was 2%. So it's a very, very ambitious sort of plan, and certainly it will require a big leap forward to meet that kind of ambition. And also there are lots of cities that introducing this carbon neutral or low carbon cities concept, like Shanghai, or at least some cities in Korea, cities in Japan like Tokyo, and other parts of the cities are all introducing this concept of low carbon development. But if you look at the literature, most of the literature are really focusing on developed countries, cities, how the low carbon cities will pan out. And there are there is a strong lack of knowledge in terms of what do we actually mean low carbon development in a rapidly developing countries setting. So I think there are lots of things that can be done in that sense, both for practice as well as for academia. But I do see a big potential in terms of looking at cities in Asia, because given its vast scale and given its number of people living there and the number of cities, if something can be introduced, then there is a big opportunity that can be introduced in a much higher sort of scale than in other parts of the world. For example, like Hangzhou, a city in China, recently introduced the bicycle renting sort of system. This is nothing new. This is a copy from some of the advanced cities in US, in Canada, and then in Europe. But then if you look at the scale, about 400,000 people are using this system a day. So you can see we're talking about totally different scale here. So that always excites me and giving me hope. So if something like this can be upscaled, can be multiplied in other part of the Asian cities, then we do have much, much stronger sort of momentum towards this sustainability that can be realized. So I remain optimistic in this sense.
Always nice to have a little bit of optimism. And turning from optimism to some very sad events. So Vanuatu experienced one of the worst natural disasters in its history this year, when tropical cyclone ravaged the island nation. Paul works in government, and I'm hoping that maybe you can just share some of the lessons learned, some of your experiences dealing with that disaster.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about some of the experiences. I don't know how many of us know about Vanuatu. I'll probably set some background into Vanuatu. So Vanuatu is in the middle of the Pacific, close to the west of Fiji, south of Solomons, Papua New Guinea. It's made up of about 80 islands. Has a population of 243. Every year it has 4,000 people added to the population, so it's around 250, 60,000 at the moment population. Vanuatu was colonized condominium by British and the French from 1906 until 1980, so we're 35 years old trying to govern our country now under the Westminster system. Inside Vanuatu as well, as the same with Melanesian countries, we have several other indigenous languages. So in the Pacific you have three types of people living in the Pacific. You have the Polynesians, much fairer skin, Tahitians, Tongans, Samoans. Then you have the Micronesians, the Marshall Islands, Gilbert Islands, Guam. And then you have the Melanesians, the big islands, darker skin like myself, Fiji, Solomons, Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia. Within the Melanesia itself, we have what's called the Melanesian valleys, which basically different ways of doing things in Melanesia. And this has a common language or pidgin English between the Papua New Guineans, Solomon Islanders, and Vanuatu. We speak, when we meet each other, we speak this pidgin English. Within Vanuatu, we have about 63 languages, about 120 dialects spoken amongst this population. And we're trying to run a government, or Westminster government. But when we had independence, we also adopted French and English. So our official languages are English and French. And then we have Islam on top. And then from an island where I come from, we have 7 languages. So you have all this array of different cultures. So Vanuatu is still trying to come to terms of how to govern itself in terms of trying to manage all these different cultural groupings, call them different nations basically. So in 2006, there was a study done by London School Economic School Foundation. They developed the Happy Planet Index, HPI, trying to measure ecological footprint and happiness. How does a country use up its resources while not impinging onto the ability of future generations to sustain themselves. So when they ran this study in 74 countries around the world, Vanuatu came up as the happiest country in the world. So I had some of these people come to Vanuatu, like from Germany, and they would, because they couldn't figure out how can a least developed country with basically no money be the happiest country in the world. So they came and they were asking me about it. But a couple of years later, there was another study done. Anyway, so this study was done. When they ran it again, they left Vanuatu out of the study altogether. So we've never been again. But anyway, a couple of studies done some years later by ADP also found out that Vanuatu is the most vulnerable country in the world to natural disasters. So we're on the fault line, Pacific Rim fire. We have volcanoes, we have earthquakes, we have cyclones, you name it, we have it. So while lots of lobbying and advocacy is being done at COP meetings and stuff about sea level rise, we have been quiet, but we're the most vulnerable country in the world. Or we haven't, and the government hasn't actually taken anything into it because we're vulnerable, but we're happy. So, and we have kava, which is basically one of those drugs, basically where you drink and it just puts you to sleep. So no worries. Anyway, so we had a big cyclone hit us in 1986-87. It was a Category 3 cyclone, 150 km/h winds. So we didn't take any lessons from that. So that was it. So when the announcements were going out and were warning that there's a big Category 5 cyclone coming, people had no idea what Category 5 cyclone warning was. And so there was lots of text messages sent out by our telecommunications into all the mobile phones. So there's network coverage now of about 94% throughout Vanuatu coverage. So there's lots of people have mobile phones. So the text messages were going out, there's a Category 5 cyclone warning coming. Most of the people in Vanuatu have a mobile phone, but they can't read text messages because 74% are almost illiterate. So the warnings were going out, well, another one of those things from TCCell, delete. Anyway, so around everywhere else, we're getting worried about Vanuatu. Vanuatu basically, out in the rural areas, there was nothing else. I was ringing by people in the village, telling them, just go inside the house, don't come out until I ring you again and tell you to come out. Just put water, firewood, and everything. So in our village, we don't have, there's no road, no electricity, no water. So most of the population in Vanuatu, 75% still live in the rural areas. So you can understand. So so when the cyclone hit, was 250 to 300 km/h winds. So imagine driving down a highway, 100 kilometers, sticking your head out, but in a racetrack, 250 kilometers per hour, pushing your head out through the window. So these were the winds that hit us. And the eye of that cyclone went over Tafia province, which is the province where I'm also helping out in terms of planning. The eye went over, so they were receiving 200 km/h winds. So basically, most of the population were living in traditional huts. They live in stuff that they make out of the forest. So you could go out into these villages straight after the cyclone. The day before there was this 60 or so houses. The next day it was nothing, just pasture. So, we were having discussions before that with the Secretary General of the province. I'm focusing on this province because it was the worst hit province. So it received 200 kilometers. I was in the capital city, and we were receiving 250 km/h winds. In this province, they were receiving 300 km/h winds. So we had no idea what was going to happen. Straight after, no contacts. But before that, we were talking to the Secretary General. No matter what, you organize community disaster groups. If the cyclone hits, you have to tell these groups before tending to their houses, you have to clear the road from the airport to the headquarters, so we can establish communication. So relief and whatever it can go in. So straight after that, even though the houses were down, people were the Australian army that came responded, and the French army came down first, went straight to Tana. They came with thousands and thousands of body bags. So that was it. We were just going to go in and remove the people. The interesting thing was, after the cyclone, the body count was 12 in overall Vanuatu. In Tana, 5, where the cyclone hit 300 km/h. No structure was left standing. People were running with the kids, standing around trees, and just going with the direction. But the good thing was, it hit there in the morning, 6 o'clock, and by 2 o'clock it was gone. It hit us in Villa around at night, and the structures, they were much more stronger. But in the south, when it hit, people were just going with the kids running around, and you could just see the roofs when it went up, it just disappeared, basically. And the people that died in Tana, the 5 people that died from concrete buildings falling on them. Yeah, those ones that lived in traditional houses, no one died, basically. So some of the things that we were, when they went down there, they were 2 days after, the village's 60 households all wiped out. 1 week later, the village was back, just like that. So we were still trying to rebuild all our big houses and stuff with cement, concrete, and all the villages were back to daily routine, whatever. The government, there was no food in the garden. Government went out 3 months later to start providing food to the people. In Tafea, 4 provinces were hit. 100% of the vegetation was gone. 98% of the infrastructure was destroyed. Cost us billions of basically dollars. So the relief effort that came in, all the international agencies that came in, UN agencies coming in to support the relief effort, government decided to coordinate all this effort. They took another, so from the time the cyclone hit, it took 3 months to coordinate all these efforts into the communities. After the relief effort ended in July, the government decided also to also coordinate the longer-term recovery. So building of classrooms, building back better, the whole thing. So when we started to coordinate this whole effort, the government also started going to, we had another political upheaval. And basically, because of the politics, instability, the recovery effort hasn't actually gone. So we still have classrooms, like 300, 400 classrooms totally destroyed, haven't been rebuilt yet, and we're working on that. But so when we were working through this relief effort, the opposition put the government to court. So 2 months ago, 14 members of the government were imprisoned for bribery. So this kind of, while this effort was going on, we have all these recovery projects all ready to kick off. The government just basically, put in prison. And then just early this month, President dissolved Parliament. So then, while all this thing was going on, we basically have no government. Now it's just a shadow government, so people like us are having to try to keep the ship afloat until we have another election in January. So meanwhile, no schools, hospitals, aid posts, nothing is gone. So the lessons that basically from that is it shows the vulnerability of small island states. One of the things that I've been doing basically is working with Hafia province, going in now and working with the chiefs. So we've been organizing the chiefs, and because people, the resilient was very, 1 week later all the houses were up in the villages. They started growing the food, and then 5 months later, the state of emergency is for El Nino, so into a dry season. So nothing was growing in the garden. So the government had to also put out another food supply relief into the villages. So the El Nino period is going to last until next year. Political instability, basically no government until then. So we've been hit on different levels. So what we've been doing basically now is going down to the provinces and working with the chiefs and telling them how can we build your capacity to be the first person to respond to the disasters. So over the years we've been, the chiefs have come to now just, or the villages or communities have just relied on the government. So the government is going to provide this. So we've gone and worked with these communities and telling them how can you respond first to this disaster. So we organized 12 tribes across from one part of the island to the other, in Tana especially, about 7,000 people, most of them illiterate. So if you're familiar with Meet the Natives, the National Geographic documentary and the movie Tana that's come out, most of these communities are around that. So basically, no education. Most of these people have chosen not to go to school, not to go to church. They just remain in custom, basically doing everything in custom. We've gone down and basically I've worked since 2012 trying to identify and ask them, well, why don't you want to go to school? What do you do basically? What are you doing? Like, the Christians, they wait for Jesus to come back. What are you doing in custom? And most of them is like, we're just doing garden. We're just making garden. So, that's a very big and deep thing. It's basically when we start talking about edge systems governance, this is basically what these people are doing. They're managing the system, garden. And when you talk about leadership, they tell you about a good leader is someone that looks after his garden, making sure the weed don't destroy the ants. And it's about also looking at the connections between. And so they, in this traditional governance system, they have experts for every area. So you have someone that looks after the seed, someone for the trees, someone for the yams, someone for the mangoes, everything. The government has been going and saying, okay, agriculture department is going to come in and run workshops for this, run fisheries and everything. So what we're doing now with this group of people is saying, okay, you can keep your custom. Now we're going to identify what do you need. We connect the fishing expert with the fisheries department. We're connecting agriculture guy with agriculture and telling them now you can use your resources to try and build a base for yourself, an economic base, but also maintaining that harmony between yourself, environment, and also collaborating with the government and watching it. So basically they're going, well, now we want to we'll build our roads, we'll build whatever. We're going to come to government if we need education, teachers, you provide us teachers, and you provide those doctors. These are people who are illiterate, have nothing, but basically they have a system that's going on. So it's a work in progress. We're going in and saying, okay, well, let's remove all the weed, all those things, cobwebs, and see what you have running there, basically. So I think in terms of moving forward and in terms of the lessons that we're learning is basically government was waiting for lots of assistance to come from outside, and we have been very heavily dependent on also with development assistance. One of the things we're looking at now is what we have on the ground that we can start relying on as the first response to disasters, but also in terms of politics. When the government is down and out, not working, there's another level of governance that's actually where the people are, that's maintaining that stability.
Yeah, I think that really flows well into the next subject, talking about vulnerability. Obviously, adaptation is an issue that we all think about, especially thinking about climate change. I think that's been happening in Paris last week. So, Joanna, you work on adaptation constraints and practice in the Pacific. So, can you just tell us a little bit more about what some of the constraints you've come across in your research and how, if they were overcome, that could improve current adaptation practice in the region?
Thanks. Yeah, so I mostly look at climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. they group the whole Pacific together. And it's usually Tuvalu, Nauru, and the most vocal, the atoll nations, Kiribati, where obviously there are very severe issues with climate change impacts, but then I think the Melanesian countries get a bit left behind, and they have quite different challenges, as Paul was saying. So most of the people, like PNG has 7 million people. So compared to that, our populations in the atoll countries, that's quite a lot, and they would face different challenges. And I think because most of the people live in rural areas, they don't actually live in urban areas. So it's been interesting to also look at the kind of policy and concept discussion around adaptation and around sustainable development in the Pacific, because we are using the terms like green growth, and that's because a lot of the donors are putting the money in green growth. So a lot of the Pacific countries, and in Melanesia in particular, they're starting to look at green growth, but some of the meetings and discussions that I've been in, when they're thinking about climate change adaptation, when they're thinking about how to move forward, they don't really, like green growth they don't really understand the concept. And it's quite interesting. And so Paul was saying the Melanesian countries have particular ways of thinking and particular like Melanesian values. And they are looking at different approaches, how they could use those kind of their own values and their own worldviews in going forward with adaptation, and not necessarily taking concepts like green growth, which mostly probably would work for developed countries. Maybe better because the situation is quite different in Melanesia, where you have people live off the land. And what's interesting is, as Paul was saying, on the island of Tanna, for example, so they have the cyclone that destroyed most of the houses, food crops, and basically most of the communities have nothing. But they also at the same time have an active volcano on the island, which erupts every 5 minutes. And there's a lot of ash that's going in the air. So actually the ash it's a long-term kind of vulnerability. So the ash keeps destroying the gardens, and it's impacting on people's health. And we've been doing some research on community-based adaptation and how they are responding to climate change, these extreme events. But you also have the long-term issue with the volcano, with the ash. And after the cyclone, the communities were starting to plant crops and seedlings, but they were destroyed by the ash in most cases. So the ash is actually affecting the growth and the size and the kind of health of the crops. And at the same time, on top of that, you got El Nino. So there's not enough water, there's not enough rain, there's not enough moisture, so that's also affecting the communities on Tanna Island. So I think in many cases you have multiple vulnerabilities, and with adaptation you kind of really have to look at the current situation, the past, but also the future, and how all these different levels of vulnerabilities and risk are actually impacting these communities. But what we see in the context of Pacific, when we talk about climate change adaptation, there's a lot of discourse around migration and relocation, and there's for Kiribati, they talk about migration with dignity. So they're trying to find people from Kiribati for jobs in Australia, in New Zealand, other opportunities so they can move away. But interestingly, we ran at Griffith, so we had a big program on nursing. So I think there were 70 people from Kiribati, young people who came, and most of them are encouraged by their families to go and have an education, and maybe they have an opportunity to remain in Australia. Interestingly, all of them wanted to go back to Kiribati. Go back to their country, go back to their families. So I think there is a lot of the times we are very focused on physical vulnerability and looking at sea level rise, atolls are going under, we need to move these people away, which kind of completely ignores who we are and the issues with culture, with identity, and And they, especially with the migration or relocation, and some Pacific countries, for instance Fiji, are looking at relocating communities, and it's not always very clear whether that communities are actually vulnerable to climate change or whether that sometimes it's one kind of way of doing making decisions for communities. And there's a lot of, I think with adaptation practice, there's a lot of issues still that what we've seen in sustainable development for decades with this kind of imbalance of, you have an climate change adaptation project, for instance, in Vanuatu or in Papua New Guinea, and most of the budget is spent on technical advisors that will come and help you to do an adaptation plan. And there's starting to be pushback from some of the Melanesian countries and some of the government departments where they say, okay, so you've given us an adaptation project for 1,700,000 is spent on technical assistance to help us to develop these policies and plans, and there's not much, the capacity building for our staff and our nationals is, it's very, very, very small. As Paul can tell you, sometimes it's very difficult to implement policy or implement guidelines or strategies that don't really understand the cultural context. So when you go to the communities, when you go to the provincial level, where most of the people live in these countries, it's the implementation process. Something that is supposed to work doesn't necessarily work. So I think there's a lot of kind of institutional and governance constraints around how we do actually do climate adaptation in these countries. And I think that's some of the government officials that I've talked to have actually said to the donors that we don't want this project. If this is the budget breakdown that we're proposing, we want, instead of having one technical advisor who is half or more of the budget, who doesn't have any understanding of our culture or our context, actually we want 2 or 3 nationals to be built with capacity and working with that advisor. So there is starting to be the kind of discourse and pushback on some of those constraints.
Fantastic. Well, I'm fascinated by all of your research and learning about all these different countries, and I have more questions for you, but I think it's already 12, so I'm going to throw it open to the audience, and if there's any burning questions there,
One sort of small question for both of you. So, with the adaptation, especially since, sort of mentioned being left behind or sort of being unique from sort of the local groups, the local island nations, what are the impacts, for example, when you move people or encourage people to go elsewhere? I mean, what are the impacts on sort of family life, family structure? You talk about the sort of maintaining the sort of the old way. Do we find those structures break down? Do we find family structure being pulled apart actually helps to lose that culture? Do people think about that when they're trying to just, bring these experts in? Are those things considered? Because the loss of those means, whether you move them or not, that culture's gone. So how do you deal with that sort of cultural aspect in this whole adaptation concept?
Thanks. I think I'll try and answer the question. Basically, it's been a whole system thing, and because I'm looking after education, one of the things that we have seen, basically, most of it was to do with education system in terms of so we've had this education system that's basically about making education a commodity. You have a qualification, you can have a job. So then there was a rush for people to go to the best schools, because then we built an education system on competition. The best and the brightest, basically survival of the fittest. So in order to do that, people were moving to the best schools, and most of the best schools were in urban areas. But also because we had a low number of schools, so you choose what are the schools you go to, and then you have to leave your island to go to that school if it's in another island. So most of this was basically encouraged by the education system. So for a period of time, students were moving into town, and then they were having this, we were creating this false expectation in them that if you have some sort of education, you'll have a job. So most of them stayed around in urban areas. So we started seeing lots of these young people, because of course most of them were not going through, because when you put, we were aiming for around 100%, or with the universal access to education, in primary education, we were putting in about 98% of young people, students going to school, and about 78% were finishing before they reached 20, basically meaning they were not going to universities. So they were just finishing in between our secondary education, having this qualification, and they were wanting to go and get a job with it. Very difficult to get a job without experience or skills. So this cycle was starting to continue. So, but it was breaking down all these things that were. Most of them finish school, they go back to the villages, and they can't grow the yam and make the house. They don't have those livelihood skills. And then also have no skills in education as well in terms of work, employability. So recently we've been looking at reforming the whole curriculum. And so most of what we're doing now, basically next year will be a new curriculum now where it's basically looking at, and so we have a program now we've been working on in terms of saying, let's roll out a 5-year plan to build classrooms in schools everywhere with a standard for category 5, solar, wireless, broadband, internet, all schools throughout Vanuatu. That's a 5-year program, and also looking at curriculum development where we've also already developed. So out of the 63 languages in Vanuatu, we've developed 47 vernacular basically languages for students to start using it. So encouraging at the primary level, start in your vernacular, and then we start moving into, but encouraging education system throughout Vanuatu that is a similar standard, broadband, putting everything on, basically downloading everything on the internet and stuff. So that's an ambitious plan, but basically looking at saying, let's try and make education available to everyone, but also maintaining, keeping people as much as possible in the villages. And then one of the things we've been doing now is going back to the chiefs now through what we're doing in Tafea and telling the chiefs. So in Tafea we've now released a 15-year plan and a 5-year strategy plan looking at basically education, skills development, and saying how can we start changing this mentality and saying we've been trying to, because you have a spectrum at the top. It's about basically saying individuals doing whatever they want to do. Now we're going back to saying, at the community level, how can we strengthen community as it is? So the whole policy has been based around basically individualization. We've also had in terms of land laws as well. It's been a big reform. So the land laws has been about basically registering the land and selling off. So within family there was lots of disputes in terms of, oh, this is my land, this is your land, and so all this we've changed the whole reform as well, and saying it's a tribal land, we keep it at a tribal level, the tribe will decide on the land, because basically in Port Vila, where the capital is, 98% of the land has been basically leased off. So the people who are basically from that island have basically, well, in the next 5 years are going to be alienated from those resource bases that they are sources of food and stuff. So, yeah.
I had a general question for anyone on the panel about research. Without putting words in anybody's mouths, it sounds to me like the issues that you're talking about are slightly different to the ones that you talked about in development countries, things like urbanisation, issues on the ground. Sorry? Sorry. I'll get straight to the point. What are the kind of methodologies and theories that you find most useful for the issues that you're looking at in the region? Like who are your favourite authors? Like what's the kind of research that works for you, and I suppose what isn't working for you in terms of the existing relationships?
I think it just might be that they each have different literatures that they focus on, so it might just be a little bit too, so I imagine, adaptation, urban governance.
I think it depends on the research passion or research topic. For example, in my case, I usually apply the theory of a social-technological system, or maybe transition theory. in that case, maybe some kind of energy maybe system change. So what kind of questions do you want to have research? In that case, maybe you can mobilize or apply different theory sources, theoretical sources, I think. So what do you want to know? That is important.
Well, I think second, what someone brought up, things like research on low carbon cities tends to be more relevant for cities in the north. I'm just asking, what's the research that's useful for thinking about issues in Asia?
Okay, I think that's a slightly different way of putting it. What I mentioned is existing empirical evidence looking at low carbon cities are mostly from developed setting, which points out the need to really look at rapidly developing and industrializing all this very dynamic setting, and then how you can at the same time achieve a low carbon sort of development. So in looking at, I use several sort of theoretical angle, for example, like urban environmental evolution, how cities actually rapidly change in this region. And then I also use urban sustainability experiment concept, which is looking at some of the good practices that are happening within these cities, and how do you actually nurture these good practices, and how do you actually turn them into something much bigger, mainstream those things. And that's in a way connected to the social technical system, sustainability transition sort of literature. So it comes back to, depending on what sort of question you ask, I think it's the theoretical grounding and conceptual lens are totally different. But I guess that actually links to, I would like to comment on the ESG research and then how the region is represented in this ESG sort of research. We all agree that this governance sort of field is quite dominated by the Western, developed countries sort of viewpoint. And if you look at the participants within this conference, it is very clear. Even though it's in sort of Asia-Pacific region, we don't really have many Asian, representation. And I think it's not only because of the funding. If you look at some other conferences, even though they don't have much funding, you still attract lots of Asia-Pacific sort of scholars. For example, I think that's related to a couple of inherent sort of assumptions within this governance sort of literature. I think it's really dominated by the view that good governance is something that has to be grounded in, democratic system. I'm not a political scientist, but just from outside. So is there a governance question that can be asked for alternative, different sort of government system, who are not entirely adopting, the purely Western sort of value and political system? Is there a good governance in there, and is there a good research questions to be asked to look at those, or does that do even worse looking at? I think this probably is a question to you political scientists who are looking at Earth system governance, because they are looking at Earth system governance, which is why we have to look at some of the alternatives. That's just my feeling.
I'd actually like anybody on the panel's views on that topic, because that is really, important to me, and also to Ruben, who's sitting back there, hopefully taking notes, because we are thinking about the future directions of the project. And I personally don't want it to be a Western-dominated, focused project. And so, if anyone has reflections on how you felt going around to other panels in the conference, how you think it could be improved to be more inclusive and to reach out to other communities. I'm curious if anyone else has any comments on that.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think it's interesting that you said at the very beginning, we're competing with a very popular panel, and I thought this is a very popular panel.
Honestly, also because of the title of the other panel, I didn't actually think it was going to be that popular.
Well, there's certainly a gender and race difference in these two panels, these two competing panels too, and I think there's an underlying critique there about, at least from my point of view, about this rubric of Earth system governance, and that goes to a lot of what you were saying, but a lot of what both of you were saying, everyone on the panel actually. So there's a lot of people, I think, in the last 3 days who would have a lot to say about what constitutes the theoretical grounding, the political grounding, the action-oriented work that to me is very lively and important.
Just very quickly, to further from your point, actually, I went to two, yesterday and earlier today, two very interesting sessions on Southeast Asia. But it also, I mean, upon attending those sessions, it became very clear that there is a clear focus on the global, which is not bad when we talk about our system governance. It's pretty evident. Having said that, though, it does need to be disaggregated, right? So, I mean, we can't possibly look at these global problems without appreciating their local and their regional roots. I mean, ultimately, it seems to be the case that regional scholars ultimately become kind of put into this very neat and self-contained category. And so the extent to which they can speak to global issues becomes inherently limited. And this is extremely problematic. And I think this is part of the challenge that Earth System Governance, the project, will have to face, because essentially you want to tackle global issues, but you also need to allow it to maintain regional relevance and local relevance as well. And this really goes back to your point about these concepts, good governance, Earth System governance. I mean, at the most basic level, the question is, how are you going to translate Earth System governance into Thai, or into Khmer, or into Chinese, or into Japanese? I'm sure in Japanese and Korean literature, you probably have already made some headway in that regard, but let's say in Lao, or in Khmer, or in, I don't know, some other language. It's not translatable almost in a literal sense, but it's also not translated in a policy sense. And this is what we see in terms of sustainable development, in terms of good governance. These are inherently Western concepts, and when you try to apply them to very culturally contingent contexts, a lot of things get lost in translation. And you do have a sizable scholarship on what governance means in different cultures and different societies, but again, that it brings up the problem of whether or not we're just simply essentializing our perceptions of those societies and those cultures. And there's really no easy answer to this, but I absolutely agree with you. I think this is something that scholars need to be much more self-reflexive about when they're studying other countries that are outside of the kind of Western liberal order, I suppose.
Yeah.